Hey everyone. Tonight we're going to dim the torches, pour something vaguely medieval into a cup, and wander down one of history's darker side streets, the lives of executioners. Now, if you're picturing a hooded man with a massive axe standing dramatically against a thunderstorm backdrop, you're not wrong, but you're also not quite right. Real medieval executioners weren't mysterious anti-heroes or cinematic villains. They were, more often than not, just guys who had very few other career options and a terrifyingly steady hand. So settle in. Let's take a slow walk through a world where death was a day job, and where the man who swung the blade could never quite wash the blood or the social stigma off his hands. The unwanted profession. Being an executioner in medieval Europe was a bit like being the rat catcher of human souls. Necessary, but gross. Everyone wanted the service, but no one wanted to shake your hand afterward. Most executioners didn't wake up one morning and think, you know what sounds fulfilling? Beheading strangers for a living. No, the job was usually inherited or forced. If your father was an executioner, congratulations, you were now born into the family business. If you were a convicted criminal who somehow managed to avoid the gallows, you might be offered a deal. Do the executions instead of being executed. A win-win, in the bleakest possible sense. These men lived on the outskirts of towns, literally and socially. They were shunned from churches, refused service at inns, and forbidden from joining guilds. Even their children carried the stain of the job. Because, of course, nothing says medieval justice like generational ostracism. But someone had to do it. Despite being treated like walking bad omens, executioners were essential to the justice system. Medieval courts were big on public spectacle. A crime wasn't just punished, it was displayed. Hangings, beheadings, burnings, all designed to make you think twice before stealing that extra loaf of bread. The executioner's role was to make sure that justice looked clean, swift, and ideally, terrifying. And weirdly enough, many were highly skilled. A good beheading took precision. One clean stroke, and the crowd cheered. Miss the mark? Well, let's just say things got messy. Some executioners became so notorious for their efficiency that they gained regional fame. There were even towns that hired celebrity executioners from other regions for important cases, like hiring a special DJ for a wedding, except with more decapitation and less champagne. The blood money. The pay? Surprisingly good. For a job nobody wanted, executioners made more than most craftsmen. They often received not just money, but also free housing, tax exemptions, and the occasional bonus for particularly gruesome cases. Think of it as a medieval hazard pay, or hush money, depending on how you look at it. Some were even allowed to keep the clothes or possessions of the executed. Others collected the fat, bones, and blood, not out of morbid curiosity, but because, in the delightful medical logic of the Middle Ages, those parts were considered healing ingredients. Executioners became part-time apothecaries, selling human fat for ointments and bones for charms. It sounds horrific now, but back then, it was just Tuesday. The social paradox. Here's where it gets weird. Executioners were outcasts, but also celebrities. People despised them publicly, but they still came to them privately for help. Executioners had practical skills. They knew anatomy, they handled sharp tools daily, and they worked closely with local doctors and surgeons. So if you needed a tooth pulled, a wound stitched, or a boil lanced, who better than the guy who could dismember you in one clean stroke? In some cities like Nuremberg and Paris, executioners were unofficially known as healers of last resort. They performed surgeries, bloodletting, even minor amputations, at a discount. You might shun them at church, but you'd still show up at their door when your legs started turning purple. A strange duality. The hand that took life could also save it. Legal immunity and moral loopholes. Executioners also had one major perk: legal immunity. Because of their profession, they were technically servants of justice, and so they were granted certain protections. They could enter forbidden areas, handle cursed or criminal goods, and occasionally commit acts that would get anyone else hanged, all in the line of duty. This led to some creative interpretations of the law. Some executioners used their immunity to smuggle goods, gamble, or run side hustles that weren't exactly wholesome. After all, if society already treats you like a monster, you might as well enjoy the perks. Still, most tried to live quietly. They often married within their own small circle, other executioner families, or widows of criminals, creating a strange, isolated community of people bound together by the same invisible stain. Rituals of the job. You might think a man who's seen countless deaths would be numb to it all, but many executioners developed their own rituals, not out of superstition, but self-preservation. Some prayed before every act, not for mercy on the condemned, but for forgiveness for themselves. Others performed small gestures, crossing themselves, whispering blessings, or avoiding eye contact with the soon-to-be dead. In France, executioners sometimes wore red robes to symbolize blood and justice. In England, black hoods became the norm, though mostly because anonymity was the best armor against angry relatives of the deceased. And yes, there were times when things went wrong. Axes missed, ropes snapped, or crowds grew violent. In those moments, the executioner's calm, rhythmic job turned into chaos. But afterward, life just went on. Another sunrise, another sentence. The family business. One of the most famous dynasties of executioners came from Germany, the Franz Schmidt family of Nuremberg. Schmidt kept a diary of every execution he performed, and he was surprisingly reflective. He documented over 350 executions and nearly as many floggings and mutilations, but his notes read less like a monster's memoir and more like a civil servant's journal. He wrote about his regret, his techniques, and even his compassion for some victims. And after 40 years of service, he retired honorably, granted citizenship, wealth, and respect. It's an odd thought. A man who spent his life taking lives was eventually honored as a symbol of justice and discipline. But that's medieval morality for you. Equal parts bizarre and bureaucratic. The strange afterlife of executioners. Even after death, executioners didn't quite escape their reputation. Many were buried outside churchyards, in unmarked graves. Some had their names scrubbed from records, others preserved in quiet shame. But their influence lingered, in folklore, as ghosts, demons, or symbols of karmic justice. Over time, society's fascination with them grew. They became figures of horror, mystery, and even pity in stories and plays. Because deep down, the medieval executioner wasn't really a villain, just a man doing an ugly job in an uglier world. And that's where we'll pause for tonight. We've peeked into the lonely life behind the axe, the paradox of power and isolation that defined the medieval hangman. Next time, we'll drift north to the cold shores of Scandinavia and see what awaited the wives of fallen Vikings. Spoiler, it's not as romantic as the sagas make it sound. So close your eyes, forget the clang of steel and the murmurs of the crowd, and remember, even history's darkest corners can whisper their stories softly. Part 2. What happened to the wives of fallen Vikings? Hey everyone! Tonight we're sailing north. The fire's still warm, the sea air is cold, and we're heading into a world that's equal parts heroic saga and absolute nightmare, the world of Viking women. Now, when most people think of Vikings, they picture towering men with axes, shouting dramatically as long ships cut through the mist. But while the men were out raiding monasteries and collecting questionable souvenirs from England, back home there was another kind of endurance test happening: the lives of the women they left behind. And tonight, we're talking about what happened to them when those warriors didn't come back. So wrap yourself in a fur blanket, ignore the smell of fish oil, and let's drift quietly into the fate of the wives of fallen Vikings. A world built on goodbye. Life in a Viking household was a waiting game. Every spring, men left for months or years to raid, trade, or die trying, and the women stayed. They weren't passive, though. Norse women ran the farms, managed trade deals, and kept slaves in check. In many ways, they were the backbone of society, but one built on uncertainty. Every boat that vanished over the horizon might never come back. There was no medieval text message saying, "Hey, made it to England safely. Be home by harvest." Just silence. And eventually, the quiet turned into mourning. So what actually happened when a Viking man didn't come home? Well, first came the waiting. A year, maybe. 2. Sometimes more. Because ships sank all the time, and sometimes people just forgot to mention it. If a man was gone long enough to be considered dead, the woman could technically remarry. But here's the catch: Viking law was regional and extremely vague. Some sagas suggest a widow could move on after 3 years of silence. Others imply she should just keep running the farm and quietly hope her ghost husband approved. If she remarried too soon and the original husband came back, which did happen, it created all kinds of awkward legal knots. Imagine explaining that one over dinner. The widow's status. A widow in Norse society could actually hold significant power temporarily. She could manage property, command servants, and even act as the head of household. In some sagas, widows appear as fierce, respected figures, like women like Aud the Deep-Minded, who led an entire clan to Iceland after her husband's death, or Lagertha, the semi-mythical shield maiden, who apparently preferred to run empires rather than bake bread. But for every independent widow, there were dozens whose lives quietly collapsed, because without a husband, protection, or a male heir, your legal and social standing evaporated faster than a Viking promised to raid just one monastery. The reality versus the saga. Popular culture loves the idea of Viking women as shield maidens, warrior queens fighting beside their men. And yes, there's evidence that a few women did take up arms. But for the vast majority, fighting meant trying to keep livestock alive during a Norwegian winter while hoping your children didn't starve. The sagas romanticize it all, of course. In the tales, the widow was noble and wise, her tears shimmering like frost as she burns her husband's body on a glorious funeral pyre. In reality, the smell of rotting seaweed and unwashed linen probably ruined the moment. The widow's wealth, or lack of it. Let's talk economics. When a Viking died, his property didn't automatically go to his wife. The inheritance usually went to sons, or if there were none, to brothers, cousins, or that one uncle who always helped out a little too eagerly. A widow could claim a portion called the mourning gift, a kind of medieval prenup given to her after the wedding night. Romantic, right? It was meant to ensure her survival if her husband died, but the size of that gift depended entirely on his wealth and his mood. So if you married a generous chieftain, congratulations, you might live comfortably. If you married a broke fisherman, your mourning gift was probably just a slightly used fishing net. The social stigma of widowhood. In Norse society, widowhood wasn't just a status, it was a label. You were no longer someone's wife, but not quite free either. Some widows recorded by other men, especially those looking to inherit their late husband's farm. Others were pressured into marriages they didn't want. Because of course nothing says romance like, my husband's corpse isn't even cold, but the cows still need feeding. And if you refused to remarry, people talked. A single woman running her own farm? Suspicious. Probably witchcraft.
Slave wives and concubines. Now, not all Viking women were free. Many were thralls, slaves captured in raids, and their fates were even bleaker. If a Viking died, his slave wife or concubine didn't get property or freedom. In some traditions, she might be sacrificed at his funeral, supposedly to join him in the afterlife. Archaeologists have actually found graves suggesting this practice. Women buried beside men, their deaths clearly not voluntary. But before you picture mass pyres and screaming maidens, keep in mind, these events were rare and heavily ritualized. Still grim, just slower. The funeral that wasn't romantic. Viking funerals were supposed to be grand send-offs. There were processions, chanting, burning ships, and sometimes very uncomfortable volunteers. Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a Rus funeral in the 10th century, described it in disturbingly vivid detail. A slave girl was chosen to die with her master. She was treated like a guest of honor for days, dressed up, given wine, and promised paradise before being killed during the funeral ritual. The men around her played drums to drown out her screams. Yes, bedtime history is fun like that. It's one of those moments where you realize how far the myth of noble Vikings is from their reality. They were brave, sure, but also casually brutal in ways that make modern true crime documentaries look cheerful. But when women fought back. But not all Viking women were passive victims of fate. Some took control in surprisingly modern ways. Take Gudrun Ósvísdóttir from the Icelandic Laxdæla saga. She was widowed multiple times and responded to each tragedy by, well, manipulating every man within a 10-mile radius until she got what she wanted. By the end of her saga, she'd caused wars, outlived all her husbands, and built herself a legacy of quiet vengeance. Or Odd the Deep-Minded, who became a clan leader, founded settlements, and held religious ceremonies, all as a widow. In a world that treated women as property, these figures stood out not because they fought battles, but because they simply refused to disappear. Afterlife expectations. Viking mythology gave widows some comfort, at least on paper. If a husband died in battle, he went to Valhalla, feasting forever in Odin's hall. Wives, however, didn't automatically join him. Their afterlife was tied more to domestic virtue and faithfulness. So while he was drinking with gods, she was expected to remain loyal on earth, preferably without smiling too much at the neighbors. In later Christianized times, this double standard only got worse. The sagas that once celebrated clever, independent women were replaced by tales of obedient, sorrowful widows. Progress, apparently. The long winter of loneliness. The emotional reality of widowhood in the Viking Age was heavy. Imagine years of isolation, endless winters, and the constant work of survival, all while society quietly reminded you that you were incomplete. Widows formed informal networks, helping one another, sharing resources, and defending each other's land rights. Some even became foster mothers to orphans or adopted young warriors, ensuring their family names didn't fade. In those quiet, unseen ways, They held the Viking world together. Because while men went off chasing glory and gold, it was the women who built the foundations that kept the culture from collapsing entirely. Legends fade, but the echoes stay. So what happened to the wives of fallen Vikings? Some starved, some remarried, some ruled. Most simply endured, their lives slipping between myth and silence. They weren't shield maidens or queens, but they were the real heart of the Viking story, the ones who stayed when everyone else sailed away. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear them, not in the clash of swords, but in the whisper of waves against a cold northern shore. Next, we'll move from the icy north to something equally chilling, but in a completely different way. Because in our next story, the danger isn't from raids or swords. It's from fleas, fear, and very bad medical advice. So in part 3, we'll drift into the 14th century, to the time when half of Europe coughed, panicked, and prayed their way through the Black Death. But for now, rest easy. History's seas are calm. And tomorrow, we'll meet the people who tried to survive the world's worst plague, armed with garlic necklaces and blind optimism. Part 3. How people survived the Black Death without modern medicine. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're staying in bed. Because trust me, this is not the kind of story that makes you want to go outside. The year is 1347. Half of Europe is about to learn that rats make terrible roommates, and that coughing could, quite literally, end civilization as they knew it. But don't worry, this isn't a horror story. It's just a slow-motion catastrophe told through herbal remedies, superstition, and sheer human confusion.
So, dim the candlelight, breathe deeply, ideally not near anyone else, and let's drift back to a time when the deadliest thing on earth was invisible and the doctors looked like very confused birds. When everything started smelling funny. The Black Death didn't announce itself dramatically. It just sort of showed up. In late 1347, a few Genoese trading ships docked in Sicily after returning from the Black Sea. On board were men barely alive, fevered, swollen, bleeding from places best left unnamed. The locals, ever hospitable, said, "Welcome, please come ashore and share that mysterious disease with everyone." Within months, it spread like spilled ink across Europe. No one knew what caused it. Germs weren't a concept yet. People thought it came from bad air, angry stars, or maybe God's disappointment in everyone's life choices. So, naturally, they tried to fix it with candles, prayers, and occasionally onions. The doctors who looked like crows. Let's talk about those plague doctors. You know the ones, long black robes, wide-brimmed hats, and beaked masks that made them look like a cross between a Gothic raven and an anxious dentist. Inside the beak were herbs and flowers, lavender, mint, and sometimes vinegar-soaked sponges to purify the air. In reality, they just made the room smell slightly nicer while everyone died anyway. But you can't fault them for trying. Medicine in the 14th century was basically educated guessing plus wishful thinking. A typical treatment plan went something like this. Step 1. Avoid thinking sinful thoughts. Step 2. Bleed out a pint or two of blood. Step 3. If that doesn't work, burn some herbs and start praying harder. It was a solid system if your goal was to die politely. A day in the life of the doomed. Imagine waking up in a medieval town. The church bells are ringing. Again, they always are.
Outside, people are burning piles of straw, hoping it cleanses the air. Cats are being killed because someone decided they spread the plague, which, ironically, made things worse, since cats were the only thing keeping the rat population in check. Inside, you're fine, probably, until you notice a small bump under your arm. It grows, it blackens, it hurts a lot, and then the fever hits. Doctors might come by with a knife, gently suggest cutting open the swelling and applying a poultice of pigeon. Yes, actual pigeon. Because apparently nothing says healing like slapping a bird on a wound. If that didn't work, and it didn't, you were basically out of options except repent faster. The Great Panic Parade. Fear spread even faster than the plague. Some towns locked their gates and refused to let anyone in or out. Others blamed strangers, Jews, beggars, or witches. Because, of course, when people panic, logic is the first casualty. There were mass executions, riots, and entire villages that vanished overnight. The few who stayed tried to disinfect their homes by burning rosemary, vinegar, and, in one particularly creative case, old shoes. Meanwhile, the rich fled to the countryside. You can't really blame them, but the irony is that many brought the plague with them anyway, so the countryside also started coughing. Love in the time of pestilence. And yes, somehow, people still got married. There are records of weddings happening in plague-stricken cities, because if half your village is dying, why not have a party? Priests would rush through ceremonies just to get them over with before the bride or groom collapsed. It wasn't romance, it was survival math. You needed partners to farm, raise children, and rebuild. And honestly, nothing says "till death do us part" like a wedding in the middle of a pandemic. The religion problem. Religion was the only institution that tried to make sense of it all. The church said the plague was divine punishment. Convenient, since everything bad in the Middle Ages was divine punishment. Flagellant groups appeared. People who walked from town to town whipping themselves to atone for humanity's sins. It was dramatic, loud, and extremely unsanitary. Meanwhile, others lost faith entirely. How could a just God allow so much suffering? It's a question that echoed through art, literature, and the quiet of every empty home. The Black Death didn't just kill bodies, it broke belief systems.
The strange cures. People tried everything. Literally everything. Toad paste. Place a live toad on the buboes. Let it suck out the poison. Urine baths. Because, apparently, hygiene was just a rumor. Drinking emerald powder. For when you wanted to die expensively. Vinegar washing. One of the few things that actually helped a little. And then there were the weird social customs. People carried sweet-smelling pomanders. Doctors prescribed laughter as medicine. One town even banned funerals, not to stop the spread, but because they were too depressing. When the world is ending, you get creative. The real survivors. Despite all this, some people did survive, and not just by luck. Certain habits unknowingly helped, like isolation. Monks or hermits living in remote areas often escaped infection. Clean water sources. Towns with wells fared better than those relying on river water contaminated by, well, everything. Cats and dogs. People who kept pets sometimes survived longer. Fewer rats, fewer fleas, fewer reasons to panic. And of course, there were the immune few. Those whose genetics, by pure chance, made them resistant. They became the accidental ancestors of future generations, the lucky ones whose bloodline quite literally survived the apocalypse. When silence fell over cities,
By 1350, entire towns were empty. Fields overgrown, churches locked, streets silent. In some regions, up to half the population was gone. Cemeteries overflowed. Gravediggers couldn't keep up. People buried loved ones in mass pits, wrapped in whatever cloth they had left. And yet, somehow, the world didn't end. When the worst was over, people crawled out of their fear and started again. They rebuilt homes, farms, and faith. They rewrote laws, changed economies, and, oddly enough, gave rise to the Renaissance. Because when you've seen death everywhere, suddenly you start to value art, beauty, and life a little more. The plague's legacy. The Black Death reshaped Europe in quiet, lasting ways. Labor shortages gave peasants more bargaining power. Fewer workers meant higher wages. Feudal lords lost control. Cities grew richer, and the middle class started to form. It's one of history's cruel ironies. Mass death accidentally sparked progress. Medical science also took a baby step forward. Doctors started keeping better records, observing symptoms, even experimenting, safely-ish. People realized maybe, just maybe, it wasn't God's wrath, but something natural. It would take centuries to name bacteria, but curiosity had been awakened. The gentle aftermath. For those who lived through it, life never went back to normal. The laughter was quieter, the prayers more personal. Every small cough carried the memory of disaster. But there was also resilience, that quiet, stubborn human instinct to survive, no matter how absurd things get. And perhaps that's the real story of the plague. Not the horror, but the endurance. People kept living, loving, planting, and dreaming. Even when the world smelled of smoke and fear, they still baked bread, sang songs, and named babies after lost ones. Because that's what people do. They keep going. Slowly, imperfectly. So, how did people survive the Black Death without modern medicine? Mostly through luck, partly through isolation, and maybe a little through that strange human refusal to give up, even when every sign says, "Don't bother." It wasn't science that saved them. It was time, and perhaps a cat or two. Next time, we'll move away from the plague pits and towards something a little more domestic, but still quietly tragic. In Part 4, we'll peek behind the velvet curtains of royal castles and see what life was like for the people who scrubbed the floors, fetched the chamber pots, and were never supposed to be noticed. Because history loves its kings and queens, but it's the servants who actually made the castles work. So, until then, rest easy. You've survived another night of strange, sleepy history.
Part 4. Rituals, Rumors, and the Weight of the Axe. So, by now, we've gotten pretty cozy with our medieval executioners, the misunderstood, oddly practical, part-time butchers of justice. But there's still something strangely mystical about them. Because for all their grim work and daily isolation, executioners were often viewed as sort of magical, or cursed, depending on the gossip that week. Let's start with the rituals, because yes, there were rituals. An executioner didn't just stroll up to the gallows whistling. No, this was serious work, and it required a certain vibe. Before a beheading, many would quietly pray. Not for mercy, mind you, for accuracy. You see, a clean cut wasn't just professional courtesy, it was reputation. A single botched swing and your name was mud. Miss the neck once, and suddenly everyone in town is whispering that you're cursed, your axe is dull, or worse, that God's punishing you for enjoying it too much. Some kept little charms on their belts, coins from previous jobs, or tiny bone tokens, supposedly to steady the hand.
Others believed in washing their blades in vinegar after each kill, a cleansing ritual both practical and symbolic. A few even had assistants whose sole job was to clean and polish the sword, as if preparing it for a royal banquet, because again, image mattered. And there's something else to remember. These were public events. Imagine standing before a roaring crowd with everyone shouting things like, "Make it clean!" or "Do it in one swing, mate!" No pressure, right? Executioners had to perform, not just for justice, but for the audience. And people really did judge their performance. Botch it, and you'd be booed. Execute cleanly, and the crowd might actually cheer. Some even threw coins. It was grotesque showbiz, but showbiz nonetheless. Now there's a certain irony here. Executioners were both despised and depended upon. Cities needed them, but no one wanted to live near them, so most were given their own quarters on the edge of town. Usually these became known as hangman's houses. Fittingly isolated, often beside rivers or cemeteries, in case you wanted a nice, peaceful walk after work. But within those lonely homes, they often had surprisingly decent lives. Free housing, steady pay, sometimes even apprentices. Sons usually inherited the profession, partly because no one else would marry their daughters, so keeping the business in the family was just efficient. Which brings us to another fascinating and mildly tragic detail. Executioners often had daughters who struggled to marry. Not because they were unattractive, many were probably quite normal, but because marrying into a hangman's family meant inheriting that stigma. There are records of young women disguising their family background when moving to new towns. Because let's face it, my dad beheads people for a living isn't exactly a first date flex. Yet despite all this, executioners often became unofficial healers. I know, sounds weird, but stay with me. See, because they were trained in anatomy and had, let's say, practical experience with the human body, locals would sometimes secretly visit them for minor surgeries or wounds, tooth extractions, setting broken bones, even crafting herbal salves. They were like the medieval version of that sketchy guy who knows a guy. Some were even believed to have a special touch, a kind of macabre blessing. For example, people used to dip their handkerchiefs in the blood of freshly executed criminals, believing it could cure epilepsy. Others thought touching the executioner's hand brought good luck, especially if he just completed a job. Morbid, yes, but this was the Middle Ages. Superstition was practically science. And speaking of science, the tools of the trade were oddly elegant. The executioner's sword, for instance, was often custom-made. No point, just two razor-sharp edges and a broad blade, perfect for clean decapitation. Many had engravings, prayers, symbols, even family crests. Some were named, like ships or beloved pets. There's one famous blade known as the Maiden's Friend, which, well, that's one way to put it. But not all executions were neat sword jobs. Most weren't. Hanging was the standard. Burning, breaking, drowning, those were all in the mix, depending on the crime and the mood of the authorities. The executioner had to know them all. Imagine being a master of 10 different ways to legally kill someone, and still having to file reports after. And the irony? Many executioners genuinely hated cruelty. Not all, but quite a few saw themselves as instruments of justice, not sadists. Some even drank heavily after jobs, racked with guilt. Others turned grimly philosophical, believing they were taking sin upon themselves so others didn't have to. But of course, there were exceptions. A few did enjoy it. The fame, the spectacle, the dark power of being both feared and untouchable. One 15th century hangman in Germany, Franz Schmidt, left behind an actual diary. He recorded every execution, every criminal, every detail. Calmly, precisely, like a man chronicling his grocery list. But what's really odd is he used his free time to heal people. Over his career, he executed almost 400 and medically treated over 15,000. The duality is almost poetic. And so as we drift deeper into this medieval twilight of law and morality, it's clear, executioners weren't just villains or victims. They were reflections of their society, necessary, uncomfortable, and perpetually caught between justice and sin. Let's float over now to another world of blood and loss, but this time, it's not about those who take life, but those left behind when life is taken. The wives of fallen Vikings, and what really happened to them once the long ships sailed home without their husbands.